Hello Year 10, hope you had a lovely half term and you got to enjoy some of the sunshine. Thank you so much for your feedback at the end of the Romeo and Juliet scheme. I have taken some of it on board and hopefully you'll see some of the ideas and strategies or things that you thought were working really well continuing into this scheme, revising A Christmas Carol. One of the elements that some of you were struggling with was writing a conceptualised introduction. Now, actually, I think that the quality of your conceptualised introductions and the quality of your analytical paragraphs is massively improving, and some of you have made some really fantastic progress. Some of you think that you're not doing the concept driven responses very well, but actually you are. So obviously we need to keep going back over it, and I think that some of you were commenting on about how in lesson time I would often model writing a response on the board, or we'd co-write a response, or I'd use questioning to write a response, and obviously that's a little bit more challenging by teaching remotely. So I have been giving you model paragraphs or the start of a response to continue and things, but I realise that that doesn't help you consolidate your understanding of the process, and it doesn't really help you understand my thought process and the steps that I go through to create an introduction. So that is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to model it by talking through how I would answer this question. I'm going to talk at times a bit more specifically about A Christmas Carol, but I'm also going to talk quite generically about how to create these openings, these conceptualized introductions. Okay, so I want to take you back quickly to the literature key skills. Now, we had a look at this when we were studying Romeo and Juliet, when we were revising it, and we started writing conceptualized openings there, but let me just return to it slightly. So you have this PowerPoint on your Google Classroom, and you also have a video that I've made for you previously about writing Band 6 lit responses in general. So it needs to be conceptual, it needs to have a big idea and a line of argument. So this is the main element that we're going to focus on today. Over the coming lessons, I'm going to focus on each one of these skills in isolation. So next lesson, we're going to focus on how to have layered analysis and also how to use quotations in a judicious and precise way. So I just want to recap being conceptual. So you need to have a big idea and a line of argument that is unique. Okay, you need to think about those big concepts that we mapped out when we first looked at A Christmas Carol, and think about which ones are applicable to this question. It is useful in the introduction to be critical as well. So although we're not going to be evaluating the success of methods, we might be evaluating how successful Dickens is in portraying his intended message. We do need to be convincing, but we also need to be tentative. So there's elements there that, and I'll pull your attention to that as we go through. So remember that there are three things that we can do when we look at the question. We can challenge the steer, we can consider the writer's purpose in relation to the steer, and we can consider multiple interpretations or meanings of the way the steer could be defined. So if I just return to the question for a second, I would be thinking to myself now, what are the main elements of this question? Okay, is it theme related? Is it character related? Is it method related? So the first thing that stands out to me is the word supernatural. So I'm just going to highlight that. Now that is the writer's methods, but that's essentially what this question is about. So I need to think about the supernatural and what my big ideas and big concepts are regarding the supernatural. Now, this is quite a specific question because it's asking me how Dickens introduces the theme in the exposition of the novel. So it's asking me how it is presented right at the very start of the novel. Okay, so that's something that I need to think about, not at the end, but how and why does it come in these elements of the supernatural right at the beginning of the novel, and what are the supernatural elements that are included? The bit question here is how. It's not why, although we need to think beyond the question, so we need to think about why. How does Dickens introduce the theme of the supernatural in the exposition of the novel? So what is it that he is doing to make the reader see that this is part of the Gothic genre, that it is part of the supernatural genre of the 19th century. Okay, so I'm going to go back now and think about the question. So it is a question, it's a how, so it's quite difficult to challenge this steer. I mean, you could, for example, if you're going to challenge the steer, you could say, oh, there's no supernatural in the exposition of the novel at all. However, there is a lot of elements of the supernatural, so that wouldn't be a particularly wise choice. But there might be a question one day that you can do that for. Now, consider multiple interpretations or meanings of the way the steer could be defined. Now, this is a very specific question, so it's a little bit harder to do that. If the question said something like, how is Scrooge presented? Then we could think that's quite open, and we could think about a range of different ways that Scrooge actually is presented. And the final one is consider the writer's purpose in relation to the steer. And I think that this is probably going to be the easiest way of doing it. Okay, this is probably going to be the easiest thing, because I can think about the fact that how does Dickens introduce the theme of supernatural in the exposition of the novel? I can talk briefly about how supernatural is presented at the outset, and then I can talk about why I think Dickens does that. And that's probably going to be the easiest thing to do here. Now, because it might be the most simple or the most logical thing to do for this question, does not in any way mean that it would be a less high level response. It will. I'll still include my my concepts and my line of argument. Okay, so just to return then, we talked about planning, writing our conceptual opening, your big idea, and then thinking of our topic sentences and then putting in our quotations. Now, it might be easier, and I know that a couple of you have found it easier, to do your topic sentences first and then try and incorporate them into your conceptual opening. Just a reminder that there is an example there for Romeo and Juliet as well, should you wish to return to this if you need more guidance. Now, I'm actually going to show you a slightly different way, which is still following this pattern, but it's just slightly different to the two major triangles. Some of you are finding it difficult to fully develop two topic sentences in order to have a really full, well-rounded essay. So it may be that you want to have 3 or 4 topic sentences, and I will talk to you about how you can do that in a moment. Oh, signed out, hold on a second. Okay, so when I'm writing my opening, I want to try and use these phrases. These are really helpful. You do not have to use these phrases, but for those of you that find it helpful to have a scaffold, a way to ensure that you are meeting the criteria of a conceptualised opening, this might be helpful. So ultimately, Dickens, this is where I would link to the question, summarise how the supernatural is presented at the opening. And then arguably Dickens, this might be a point that I feel is open to interpretation, and it's my thought, it's my line of argument, and I want to be tentative at the end about the writer's purpose. So perhaps Dickens, because I don't know what Dickens was trying to do, I just know what I think he may have been trying to say based on a range of different reading around the text, my interpretation of the text, other critics and academics' interpretations of the text. Okay, but we don't actually know 100%. We're quite lucky because Dickens did speak quite a lot about A Christmas Carol, so we know some of the things that he intended. Okay, so I'm going to return to the question now. So I'm going to start with ultimately, okay, Dickens. So again, you don't have to, but it's useful to do this. Now I want to think specifically about the question here and what Dickens does. So what I know that 2 of the things that Dickens does is he creates this really supernatural atmosphere, and there's the sense of the fog and the obscurity, which I know is an element of Gothic, is a Gothic convention or a trope of Gothic literature. So it creates this sort of sense of foreboding, but it also adds to this idea of not being able to see things properly, things being obscured, and sense of terror in that. So we know that the atmosphere is created at the outset to be in that way, but we also know that there is this question around Marley right from the outset. He was dead to begin with. So we know that something sinister is going on here. There is somebody who is dead and now is no longer dead. And the fact that that is repeated throughout the opening really drives home the idea that there is something supernatural going on. So I want to sort of summarise that a little bit. So I'm going to say that Dickens immediately introduces us to the theme of the supernatural in the exposition of the novel. You'll see there that in the supernatural in the exposition of the novel is directly taken from the question. I think it's really important to do that to show the examiner that you know what you're doing and that you're completely focused on the task. So ultimately, Dickens immediately introduces us to the theme of the supernatural in the exposition of the novel. How does he do it? Through his use of Gothic conventions. Yeah, that's okay. So I'm going to say now how does he do it specifically? I'm not going to go into too much detail because actually this can be a whole paragraph where I can analyse the use of atmosphere and the methods they're created, which is a really interesting bit of writing that I can say quite a lot about. So the atmosphere, or maybe the initial atmosphere, is presented as, and I need to use some really sophisticated vocabulary, or really precise at least. So the initial atmosphere is presented as eerie, foreboding, and with a sense of obscurity created through the fog. Okay. Now, what does that do? So I'm saying what happens, but what does it do? This foreshadows. What does it foreshadow? We don't know specifically, but it sort of foreshadows something, I'm going to say disastrous, and creates a supernatural terror. Because I know that terror is an element of supernatural, and there is this fear. It's quite foreboding, meaning that it's creating a sense of something bad is going to happen, and we do actually know that it is foreshadowing something in retrospect, but it's creating this sense of terror. Okay, we don't know what is happening because we know we're in the setting that we would expect to see in a horror film. It is a trope. Okay, that means it's a convention that we expect to be part of the form, and so we know that therefore something bad is going to happen. It's also the 19th century, so we're well used to a range of different Gothic texts with supernatural elements in it. So I want to be a bit more specific, because we're just talking about the fact that it wasn't just the atmosphere which was created. I could go on there, but then it wouldn't be an introduction, it would just be my essay. So now I want to talk about Marley. So I'm going to say that Dickens, and I want to be critical, so I need to use some of those critical adverbs. So I could say expertly, or I could say skillfully, masterfully, any of those. Dickens expertly uses the appearance of Marley as a repeated motif. I'm trying to put in as many as much sophisticated terminology as I possibly can, as a repeated motif and then as a revenant. Now remember that that's one of the conventions of Gothic literature or supernatural. It's something that keeps returning. Okay, so we know he's dead to begin with, we know he's going to return, and then he does return, okay, with an important message. So why does he do it? In the first stave of the novella, why does he do it? I've just realised that that should be novella as well. I was thrown off by the question. The stave of the novella. Well, yes, it creates a sense of supernatural. We know it does because Marley is a ghost, and ghosts are supernatural. Okay, so that would be an okay thing to say, but we need to think beyond that. We need to think a bit more wide. So what is the point of Marley? What message is Dickens trying to convey through his use of Marley? So I'm going to say Dickens expertly uses the appearance of Marley as a repeated motif and then as a revenant the first stave of the novella to engage the reader through... actually, that's not going to sound very good. We need to stay away from what it does for the reader anyway. We've talked about that before. So in the first stave of the novel, to illustrate a sense of the supernatural and ground the as a seemingly, and I'm going to say seemingly because we know that Dickens subverts the form of the Gothic quite a lot. So I'm going to put Gothic text, okay, because actually he does subvert that quite a lot. Now I'm starting to stray from the point, so I need to bring it back around. So, however, arguably, this should be an arguably really, shouldn't it? Arguably, Dickens uses Marley in this polemic, because we need to remember that it is actually, there's a purpose to this, which is almost a social criticism. There's a parable element, a moral tale, it's allegorical. So we need to try and include some of these terms into our responses. So it's not just a Gothic text, there is an element of the humorous there, but it's also a polemic. So, however, arguably Dickens uses Marley in this polemic to... Now I've used illustrate quite a lot. Now if you're struggling for verbs, I've got a whole list of useful purpose verbs here. To challenge, to galvanise, reflect, provoke, memorialise, communicate, criticise, mock, warn. I'm going to go with criticise because I think that's what Dickens is doing. And I put arguably so I can get away with saying it. However, arguably Dickens uses Marley in this polemic to criticise Victorian society which idolised, this is a little nod to Another Golden Idol Has Replaced Me. Victorian society which idolised financial gain in a bid to encourage readers to be more altruistic, extraordinary me, our core values, towards the most destitute members of society. We know that Dickens was a humanitarian. In fact, we could put that in. However, as a humanitarian, or just put that, arguably, as a humanitarian, Dickens may be using Marley in this polemic to criticise a Victorian society which idolised financial gain in a bid to encourage readers to be more altruistic towards the most destitute members of society. The use, I need to come back to supernatural again, so the use of the supernatural theme serves as an excellent vehicle. Like, why, if you're writing a polemic, my question here to myself is, if you're writing a polemic and it is supposed to be allegorical about how bad everyone is in society, why use elements of the supernatural? So I need to tie those two ideas together now. So the use of the supernatural theme serves as an excellent vehicle to, I need another verb, warn society. Now I know that during this time religion is, we're talking about the sort of Christian revivalisms going on, and this strong belief in morality that sort of underpins society at this stage. So, and I know Dickens obviously felt that perhaps the church in itself was corrupt. So we've got the use of the supernatural theme serves as an excellent vehicle to warn society that they were participating in corrupt and immoral practices that would be detrimental to their Christian souls, were they not to heed the warning. And I can tie this back round because the warning actually comes in the form of Marley. Marley, we know, wears the chains he forged in life. He's condemned to walk in purgatory along with other people who didn't learn their lessons, who didn't, have the redemption that that we know Scrooge has by the end of the novella. So heed the warning. Being presented to them. And I'm just realising I haven't got the word perhaps in there, so I need to go back and put that in a minute. Okay. Perhaps the supernatural conventions allows Dickens to allude to and really emphasize his message, albeit in a veiled way. Because it's interesting, isn't it? Because being presented. Because in one way it seems really overt, and then in other ways it seems quite veiled, because this is just a story about some people. It's not a real story because it's supernatural. Although a lot of people at the time did believe that you could communicate with the dead, and that element of spiritualism was particularly popular. So let's just reread it through one more time. Ultimately, Dickens immediately introduces us to the theme of the supernatural in the exposition of the novella through his use of Gothic conventions. The initial atmosphere is presented as eerie, foreboding, and with a sense of obscurity created through the fog. This foreshadows something disastrous and creates a supernatural terror. Dickens expertly uses the appearance of Marley as a repeated motif and then as a revenant in the first stave of the novella to illustrate a sense of the supernatural and ground the text as a seemingly Gothic text. Arguably, I've put text twice, I might change that bit. Ground the story as a seemingly Gothic text. Arguably, as a humanitarian, Dickens may be using Marley in this polemic to criticise a Victorian society which idolised financial gain in a bid to encourage readers to be more altruistic towards the most destitute members of society. The use of the supernatural theme serves as an excellent vehicle to warn society that they were participating in corrupt and immoral practices that would be detrimental to their Christian souls were they not to heed the warning being presented to the reader. Perhaps the supernatural conventions allow Dickens to allude to purgatory and really emphasise his message, albeit in a veiled way. Cool. So I feel that that is done. It's quite a long introduction, but that's actually okay because I've said quite a lot. And if I, as an examiner, if I saw a response like this, I would think, yeah, okay, they've got to give me some textual detail now and they've got to analyse methods in a bit more detail. But actually, a lot of what we want to see is already happening. We've got a big idea and a line of argument. It is critical. It is convincing. I know what I want to say. We haven't got the layered analysis, but we are thinking about context and less explicitly, because it's not just shoehorned in on the end. I'm showing that I understand Victorian society, that I understand corruption and morality and the conventions of the supernatural and the ideas about Christian revivalism and the poor law and the Malthusian principle, and all of that is subtle and it's in there. But I'm not saying in 1824 there was the poor law and this said that. Okay, I'm not doing that. I'm taking all of those ideas and I'm saying what I want to say with it. So actually I've done a lot of the work to get myself a full band 6 already, even though it seems a bit long. So the next thing that I want to just quickly talk to you about is, if you don't feel like this is working for you, although I feel like it is for most of you, then another thing that you can do is, once you've written this, this is in a way a short essay plan. So what I want to do is I want to highlight now all of the concepts. So all of the big ideas / concepts. So I'm talking about Gothic conventions there. Okay, I'm talking about the use of Marley as a repeated motif and as a revenant. I've got this idea about Dickens being a humanitarian. I've got this idea about society participating in corrupt and immoral practices. I've got this idea of poverty and greed actually here. And yeah, this idea of Christianity and purgatory and the fact that it's a polemic and a political message. So these could be my paragraphs. So if I actually was thinking I could talk about the Gothic conventions in the setting as a whole paragraph, just go into a bit more detail and elaborate. Marley as a repeated motif, and then talk about the other ghosts in the same way. Dickens as a humanitarian, the idea of poverty and greed. All of this could be like the structure of my essay, as long as I kept bringing it back around to the supernatural. And that is one of the things that is so great about these introductions. Okay, so if you feel that you don't want to split your essay into 2 parts, that's something you can do. Now, of course, in the real exam, you will have an extract, but the most successful responses almost forget that. They will draw on the extract, but remember that you're in control of this and you're leading this and you've got an understanding of the whole text. You don't need to just rely on the extract for your response. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. I know that was quite long, but it should be useful for other lessons to come. So keep referring back to it, and let me know at the end of your work. Do a Dear Mrs. B and just tell me if you found it useful, or any other ideas you've got, or any other things that you would like me to put in place moving forward. Okay, hope you're enjoying the lesson. Bye.